So the topic that I chose to research for my psychology class is how do childhood natural disasters affect their brain health and anxiety later in adulthood. So the introduction. Anxiety is a disorder that can affect every person and sometimes can even go unnoticed. Anxiety is a feeling of fear, dread, and uneasiness and persistent worry about everyday situations. My research question was how do natural disasters or scary events in a young person's life affect their mental health at an older age? My hypothesis is that if there is a natural disaster or scary event in a young person's life, then they might have PTSD or worse mental health at an older age. So, the methods psychologists can study this question by doing tests or taking samples from different areas that have experienced natural disasters. A sample one that I was able to find what took place in South Australia in 1983. This was a bushfire that wiped out a school with many kids attending it. There was a sample and the controlled sample taken from nearly 800 students that attended this school. They took in the account of jobs, locations, and any other medical conditions. So, from my first empirical source, I looked at the impact of natural disasters and how they affect the kids. And this is where my wildfire information comes in. So the study was done with children who were bushfire exposed cohorts. So these fires took place on Ash Wednesday on February 16, 1983. The participants in the study were children that were around in a 2-year time frame after the fires had taken place. All of the schools with children that participated in this study were affected by the bushfires. The age of these kids when the bushfire took place was between 8 and 9 years old, and the year that they did the follow up test was when they were between 28 and 29 years old. Even though they were still pretty young at the time, they were still able to get significant results because it had been 20 years since the event. The next thing that these people did was a control sample. They did this in the year of 1985, which was 2 years after the bushfire in South Australia. But it was at a school that had kids that were not affected by the fires. There were 725 kids that participated in the control sample study. The age of the kids were between 7 and 8 years old, and 20 years later, when they did it again, they were between the age of 27 and 28 years old. That is where they took into account living conditions, jobs, and any other medical conditions so that everything could be mainly the same except for the fires. The studies mainly found that most of the adults 20 years later, the bushfires were the worst event that they had ever encountered. There was an increase in the rate of PTSD, and there was also an increase in alcohol consumption and drinking problem levels. They were able to find these results by doing different tests and surveys. The second empirical source that I used to talk was talking about people went about getting help after the fires. Some people had to find psychiatric help because their symptoms were so severe and their families could not understand how awful it was in a way that could help them out. The one thing that I did find interesting is that there was an increase in handicap it experienced during this time. But that is because they were struggling so hard to overcome and cope with things that there were some that had self-harm involved. There were also many losses in the fires that people had to overcome mentally as well. This information matters because it can help psychologists or just doctors in general learn about what happens to society when a natural disaster hits. This would help them deal with people in an easier and more calmer way. This information could be used to create resources or outreach events so that when there is another disaster, people can cope with it more easily. I think that they could do research on how long it takes for these feelings to set in, or if there's a certain age in life when they experience these feelings more than others. So, my results. This research was done 20 years after the fires had happened, and it was found that there were many different conditions that had been linked to the devastating fires. Many had to search for psychiatric help, and some developed disorders. Another source that I read mentioned that there was an increase in PTSD cases and alcohol addiction while coping with the stress of the fires. The top graph on this presentation is a chart that on the left in the black box, it talks about the extreme weather events, and then the farther right you go, it talks about the mental health impacts that it can have. And then in the bottom right corner, it has impacts. And in the blue, it says short term. In the purple, it's long term. And just different things that can affect with that. And the bottom picture is a picture of the South Australia wildfires when they struck. And that is all for my presentation. Thank you.